We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisades Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is David Murin, global forecaster and author of Breaking the Code of History, Led by Lions, and Red Lightning. David, thanks for joining me today.
Great to be back, Tom. It seems to be a long time since we were last speaking.
It's always crazy to me how short it feels like between guests sometimes, and then how long the actual time between interviews ends up being. But either way, looking forward to kind of refreshing a lot of these thoughts and a lot of the predictions. As you're being a global forecaster, a lot of these predictions have really come to fruition, come to light that you have made. But, David, I'd like to start by talking, or maybe kind of rehashing this idea of the difference between lateral and linear thinkers. With the rise of all of the conflicts in the world, is this a case of the lack of lateral thinkers in positions of power at this time?
In the West, certainly so. Mm-hmm. So I would argue that on the empire cycle we've talked about, on the way up, systems are built by maverick lateral thinkers who go out and build, and governments then, are more lateral. In fact, the whole system becomes lateralized after regionalization and the Civil War, which lateralizes the winning side. They run down the resource chains and they charge out there. By the time the empire starts to become mature, then the lateral balance is starting to change, and linear people in a more controlled, predictable world start to bring their political skills to play and building large institutions to represent the empire. And then by the top, you've got this battle that takes place, and the laterals lose, and the linears take control of an empire which is now dominant because the variability and uncertainty disappears. And of course, gradually, as that just like a virus keeps spreading, bigger institutions, bigger everything, there's less and less room for lateralization. But because the system has such momentum, you can't see it failing in front of you. And that's where overextension comes in. And then at some point of reverse, you end up with this declining phase. And the declining phase is just peppered with people who've got institutional political control, who are highly linear, who haven't really thought about another world than the one that they think runs on railway tracks. And the net result is the system is unadaptive. And it then encounters another system which is going through its rising phase, which is lateral. So interestingly enough, I would argue that war has a social function, and that function is to lateralize the winning side. And the winning side then becomes dominant. Not only do they become creative in war and new technologies arise from it, but the subsequent period of peace becomes incredibly fruitful as long as the system has lateral momentum, until finally it runs out of steam and becomes more linear. Today, we're probably, I would argue, the most linear of any human society ever, because you've had 20 years of sophisticated money printing, which have meant that Western adaptation and productivity have just kept declining as we printed more and more money to compensate. But in the other side of it, the Chinese are highly adaptive, much as they're communist, and we'd like to think, as capitalist democratic countries, that communism can't think for itself. You've just got to go and look at 50% more patents a year from China, and got to see their military revolutions of affairs and adaptations to realize just how dangerously creative they are right now, and how moribund the West is in the way it thinks of new ways of fighting and being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this idea that we become I think the way that you put it, we've become a society that is on railroad tracks. That is I don't want to say it's a static system, but it doesn't have the ability to respond to dynamic threats, right? And so
And Biden's administration is the most perfect example. Mm-hmm. I mean, Jimmy Carter was a bit like it, but Biden is this person on steroids, this hubristic individual who thought that he was an expert in foreign policy and has literally just screwed up everything he's touched. And furthermore, he portrays a sense of endemic weakness, not just because of his age and decrepit, in a sense of presence, but also his policies, which have been, which go right the way back to when he was a younger man. And what he really is a far greater appeaser than Chamberlain ever was, as Sunak is, but Biden particularly, because they're the world's hegemon. And every confrontation, like Afghanistan, or withdraw, well, that basically precipitated Ukraine. A fear of basically beating Russia precipitates a process where Ukraine is now really struggling. and may well lose at this rate because it just doesn't have the manpower and the resources needed as Russia has gone on to a full wartime, economic basis, and the West is still half asleep. And you go and look at what's taken place in the Red Sea, where the Houthis have shut the Maritime waterway, which is the most appalling thing of all the failures America's had in 20 years. I cannot tell you how this failure ranks at least twice as high as any other, because it means if you can't control the sea routes, if you can't stop the Houthis from shooting merchant ships, because you just don't have the capabilities, that ushers in the doom of an empire. And I think history will look back at the Red Sea as probably the most significant American failure. If Biden had any courage or strategic vision, he would have put every resource America had, flattened the Houthis to keep the sea lanes open. But he hasn't. And everywhere he goes, he weakens the process by stopping and not joining in with Israel in a strike of retribution against Iran to remove its nuclear capabilities. He's just kicked the can down the road a few months while the Iranians try and make a nuclear breakout. Every single decision he makes is strategically disastrous and actually precipitates this acceleration of into conflict as China now weighs up whether it should join in.
Mm-hmm. Well, David, when we think about, let's say, the broader picture of that Red Sea conflict and the Houthis taking aim at these merchant ships, could it be seen, diplomatically as a difficult situation that would escalate tensions if they stepped in and really did a more effective job of protecting those ships? And is it America's and Biden's actual responsibility to do that?
Well, okay, America is, whether it likes it or not, an empire. Mm-hmm. Everyone in the American continent has derived its wealth and well-being from the sphere of influence America created after 1945, reinforced by military power. So when they say it's not our business, it comes straight the way home to, do you wish to live with the quality of living you have? And at the moment, the empire is shrinking and their quality of living is shrinking coincidentally. So saying it's not my responsibility as an American is not to understand what America is. It's an empire. It's an empire that has a more complicated control mechanism than overt colonialism. But nonetheless, it's an empire comprised of military power, a sphere of influence, and dollar extraction from everyone else. Mm-hmm. And that's now shrinking. So if I was an American, I would wish to maintain my standard of living. The first place I want to see is the maintenance of the boundaries of my empire that they don't recognize even exists. So that's the first thing. Mm-hmm. And America is essentially a global maritime hegemony, just like Britain was. So when a sea route is closed, that is a challenge to the whole construct of how you extract wealth and resource from the world. And a sea lane like the Red Sea is critical in its own right. But what's really happening is that China back in 2018 deployed anti-ship ballistic missiles that are far more sophisticated than the ones that the Houthis are using. And its goal was to destroy American carrier power, to keep it out of range of the mainland and to deny access and to an area inside the second island chain. And subsequently, it's added longer range DF-26s and DF-17 hypersonic weapons. And really what the Houthi process has been is a test run, much as the Spanish Civil War was for the Nazi Condor legions, the first test of blitzkrieg in real warfare, which then enabled Hitler to use those lessons and employ them against Europe successfully in 39 onwards, in Poland and in France in 1940. So we shouldn't look at this as an exclusive process. In fact, I suspect that the optical electric processors that are actually targeting these very simple anti-ship ballistic weapons probably come all the way and designed from China via Iran. So we've now seen a very real test that the thesis of the PLAN and the CCP to exclude America is real. And believe me, they have thousands more weapons. They're far longer range. They're far more sophisticated. So if you can't stop the Houthis, if you're Xi sitting in office having a conversation with generals and admirals, he now knows that he has in his grasp a weapon that can eject America within a few hours and destroy most of Japanese capabilities at the same time with these systems. And the failure to actually prosecute the Red Sea successfully by Biden, which you could argue is just, what would happen if the Houthis got hit really hard? Probably, I don't see an escalation in that. Far more an escalation if you deal with Iran and it is nuclear power, and then it stops the oil flowing out, which would then affect Biden's election prospects. But actually, the Houthis, it's just a matter of willpower. and they've totally failed. And people should have been asking the question, how did the Houthis survive against the Saudis, who had very similar technology, probably less effectively used than the Americans by a factor of 3 or 4, but similar technology, and they still carried on fighting the Saudis in the coalition. So if they managed to get battle hardened in that space, it's going to be much harder to beat than just a few people you could beat back when a carrier turned up. So we didn't appreciate that. It was hubristic. But needless to say, the Red Sea failure is very dramatic.
Well, I appreciate your explanation of that situation because, it is such an important maritime shipping lane. And as you say, it can, in just the case of Iran's oil, that can affect the price of everything in the rest of the world and domestically for the US, not just that one particular situation.
Well, and I think the situation is even more complicated because by closing off the Red Sea and sending ships now around South Africa, many people in South Africa failed to realize that the Cold War was the thing that triggered the end of apartheid. Because during the Cold War, the Western powers needed a secure Western-orientated power to secure that trade route. And when the Cold War ended, we could no longer tolerate, for social reasons, the concept of apartheid. So apartheid ended. And that was linked to the geostrategic importance of the waterway on the southern tip of Africa. Now everything is going around that waterway again. And we should note the ANC is incredibly not in the Western camp anymore. It's joined the Russian and Chinese camp. And the Russians and Chinese are operating very sophisticated strategies to deny Africa to the West, even though they won't be able to get naval power there initially. They are creating all sorts of movements in governments, ejecting America from the Niger and other places, the French too. And they're really making Africa, if they can't have it, we can't have it. And the trouble is that their ability to have access to the South African government and deploy missile systems on the tip of the South African, continent now is very real, in my opinion, which means you can't get anything between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic, but that bifurcates the world. So we're looking at some very serious repercussions that people haven't thought through. On the other side, you've got, Argentina, which is now moving into the Western fold very strongly. So for the Chinese, they're bifurcated off the tip of Africa. But this is how Britain won the world. It won it by understanding controlled choke points. And America's understood that, but we seem to have forgotten the root of power. But the Chinese have understood every element of it in seeking to challenge America in the West. So we're asleep at the switch.
So, David, if our leaders were aware of these historical cycles of war, is it possible that we could have avoided this conflict in the Ukraine?
So I would agree. Yeah, I really strongly say yes. And in fact, dedicated 20 years of my life to understanding the cycles of empire and how they're regulated by this Kondratiev cycle of 56 years, which every 112 years creates this hegemonic conflict. So let's just look at where we are. I think that we are in World War III, and the peak of the Kondratiev cycle into that is 2030. So 8 years before, in 2022, the invasion of Ukraine was the beginning. If you go back to the next cycle, the war started in 1914, and the Kondratiev cycle peak was 1920, 6 years before. If you go back to the challenge of Britain against France, which were the Napoleonic Wars, although we've been challenging through the 7 Years' War and onward, it was really the final challenge. It started in 1798, and the peak was 1808. That was 10 years before. And if you go before, then the French were basically challenging the Spanish for continental control. So you can see these big hegemonic challenges take place every 112 years. And I tried to argue and explain that war was inevitable with this cycle, which is not just about resources, it's about entropic pulses, which create disharmony and trigger the moment at which one nation will challenge another and go to war. And there's a lot of work on my site about it, which will give people clarity to it. But yes, if I could have actually spoken to the populace to demand that whoever it was that was in power had to act full spectrum deterrence, which is political intention, conventional military intention across the spectrum of air, sea, and land, and nuclear deterrence, and also a fifth leg, and that is the deterrence through preventing weapons innovation from overturning the power base. So the moment that these anti-ship ballistic weapons appeared in the Chinese hands, the West should have applied maximum power to create the systems that would counter them, whether they were anti-ballistic missile capabilities or lasers, whatever it was, we should have put huge resources in to maintain our advantage. And we didn't. the hubris that took place as they appeared and we laughed at them and people thought they weren't to make a difference was no different from battleship captains who didn't understand that aircraft carriers would kill them before they could even see their enemy. Same process. So education could change the way we act. Consciousness and awareness of the process that systems rise and fall, whatever system they're led by. They're like viruses. We are, as humans, the systems we create expand to their limits, and they will literally, whatever concept they have at certain times, go to war with someone else if they want something or to defend it, democracy or autocracy aside. So we need to be more realistic. And the reason I would argue is that we use war for our evolutionary process. The greatest evolution mankind undergoes is conflict because it forces adaptation, lateralization, and innovation. So all of the great shifts in our societies have taken place through war. So until we actually understand that, understand who we are and how we enact our evolution, we can't find a substitute or find the ways to stop it. And so, yes, we could, we haven't, to my great sadness, because I've tried for 20 years to warn people and explain people what this was. And now we're going to have to relearn how to survive and win.
You predicted many years ago that China's rise would really become a threat to the West. So how do they fit into the current conflicts, or are they gearing up for a greater conflict as this cycle accelerates?
So let's look at the biggest cycle. The biggest human cycle is how human systems are led. And, you can go back to Athens, that was a sea power and therefore more lateral, people with more responsibility individually because they went to sea with their own command structures. And they experimented with early forms of democracy. We wouldn't recognize it, but they were about the mobilization of the people. And so they were more democratic, but not like we are. And then again, Sparta, that was very much hierarchical and run by a king and a land power predominantly. So if you go to Rome went through the Republic issue or the empire. When it had a great emperor like Maximum Aurelius, it was basically a brilliant time. And when you had a bad emperor like Nero, it was a terrible time. So the Republic was trying to smooth out those processes. So today we've got democracy, which is in a mature form and a weak form of its version, and we've got autocracy struggling once more with this great process of how hierarchy and democracy, which one wins. It can actually go back to the First World War, can go back to Napoleon, who was more dictatorial than basically the states around him, and they all called him the great dictator. Goes back to the Kaiser, who was more dictatorial, and certainly Hitler in the second evolution. So underneath these great hegemonic conflicts, they represent not two systems that are similar, but two differential systems based on a different organizational protocol. So that's one thing. And so that's one conflict we've got, and it's a big conflict. And at the moment, autocracy has some huge advantages through computer software and computer technology, which is centralized control on a level we've never seen before. So I'd argue actually that as China comes towards us, it's better equipped as an autocracy to control its people with strategic intent successfully than any nation we've seen of that similar system. And at the same time, AI systems will start to equal the process of shorter kill chains that the West has, because it devolves command structure to individuals who can take responsibility and decision, because that's the nature of our society. And AI is going to change that to our detriment in the West and to the positiveness for the other side, because they can give decisions to machines that think as quickly as our machines. So that's one downside. But going back to your question, all of these processes and the conflicts we're seeing now in Ukraine and the Middle East are linked. They're linked quite simply to the power China has to challenge America, which has emboldened its allies. Think of China as the hub of a giant wheel, and on one spoke there's Russia, another spoke there's North Korea, and another spoke there's Iran. And essentially two of those spokes provide resources and energy into the Chinese system. And one of them is basically just a surrogate sitting on the tip of North Korea. So everything we've seen is basically Xi pulling the strings. I still go back to, the invasion of Ukraine. And I bet Xi said, we'll be right behind you. No, they are behind them, but much slower than Putin would have envisaged. I'm sure that via China, and what was going on in Iran, in Ukraine, the Iranians had their other issues, which was high inflation, and they needed to move to create coherency, but they were probably assured that they would be supported in their move on the 7th of October. So this is an entirely coincident, coherent, integrated axis of autocracy, which is now strategically aligned. The only piece that's missing is when China chooses to make war on the West. and America and seek to remove Japan and America from the whole of the second island chain. I think that's much closer than people imagine. I think we're into the real imminency of it. And it's no longer about Taiwan. Taiwan is not the issue. It's the whole second island chain, which includes South Korea, Japan, Indonesia. It includes the Philippines, all of it. If you look at the footprint of the Empire of the Sun, that's essentially what they wish to create. Only this time they wish to incorporate Australia. So there's no fight back or base or fight back for the Americans when they try and get back into the region, which is how Australia was used. It was like the aircraft carrier in the Pacific that Britain was to Europe. So it's really a rerun because it's shaped by topography, but it's very imminent and it is happening right in front of our eyes, and we really need to wake up.
David, it seems very difficult to get an accurate picture about China in many different aspects. We hear of credit bubbles collapsing, housing bubble collapsing, and I saw, for example, a chart of their money supply expansion since COVID that dwarfed the US's expansion. So how much negative news do you think they released deliberately as a way to create confusion and maybe underplay their true strengths?
Look, that's a very Sun Tzu question, which is the one we should always be asking, because everything about their challenge since the third Taiwan Straits crisis in 1996 has involved the art of war on every level. And making themselves look weak when they're stronger is part of that protocol until they strike. But I think we can safely assume that they did do something at the release of COVID in 2020, and that was they shifted from an export-driven economy into one that was internally fueled by a consumer society with a very large gap in demand. And everything that we've seen has seen a lack of demand as they shift. Now, why do you shift to that basis? You shift because, like Nazi Germany in March 1936, you want to go to war with your neighbors. Yeah, and you stockpile resources, as the Chinese have done in epic scale. And you take the demand gap and you use the demand gap to actually build your weapons base. All of those things have been happening. If you look at ship production and weapon production in China, it's much bigger than we imagine, is my guess. So yes, I think that part of their picture is a deception. But simultaneously, they created a camouflage of Western capitalism, which is how they attracted the stupid Western money to come over to China and have a low inflationary manufacturing base, deindustrialize the world and give China the industrial base to beat us. But they don't need that camouflage anymore. And many of the people who are wealthy act as a distraction or a threat, in effect, to the power of the CCP. So we're simultaneously seeing the collapse of the free market system because they don't need it anymore. They want to go into a full communist, totalitarian war economy. And so all of those things combined. And if you look at what we see, I think they fit into both categories and the fusion of the two to make a picture which I think means that she's running out of time. Just as Hitler ran out of time and he had to go to war by 1940 or be bust, so there it was in 39. I think China is in the same state. It invests in the next jump, and it either makes the next jump and integrates the second island chain and the land block of Russia and resourcing, and then it consolidates an industrial base, and then it goes to the next stage. So the war we are in that started in 2022 is a decade-long conflict because no one can outright win that Pacific War. If America is ejected, it's still a mainland American power, and it becomes a war machine, and it becomes productive. And then the issue then, China does the same, and which one's going to come out with the most weapon systems? Now, we know what happened in the Second World War. It was America, and no one stood a chance. At the moment, the odds are stacked for the Chinese with their industrial base, unless somehow or another they run out of resources, which is why they've got such a close strategic relationship with Russia, because Russia is rich with resources. And the speed at which railway tracks are built, for example, in Ukraine to compensate for the Kerch Bridge and any damage that might be done, shows you just how quickly nations with intention can build huge things. And if there's one nation on earth that can do incredible things with its engineering, it's the Chinese.
Well, David, as we're thinking about this need for more resources and, a bigger land package, any of these issues, that seems like this, pointing exactly to the rise of the BRICS nations. So does that play a significant role to this strategy that China is using to bring them more strength and resources?
Well, look, I think the ultimate war strategy that's shaping China is it realizes that actually its navy is not a blue water navy able to sustain resource chains that come from Africa or from South America. So what's going on in those countries is far more about strategic denial to the West than actually wartime resource gathering. And I think their first great reversal has happened in Argentina with Milei, who's literally turned against them. We eject any of their interests, which take place on the southern tip, and it gives the West a real toehold in that area. If the same thing could happen to South Africa, then the West would be in pretty strong shape in that respect. And I think we need to wake up. I mean, Milei came about through the frustration of the people, whereas I think South Africa needs a regime change away from autocracy. And it has many people that, would be horrified to realize that's where they've ended up. But, it also needs Western engagement, because without support and political activism, all those things which the Chinese and the Russians have been doing in spades. I mean, if you look at the ICC and you look at the infiltration of global bodies like the World Health Organization over the pandemic and their role in terms of allowing and facilitating the spread of the pandemic. And now you're looking at the ICC, which is, trying to bring Netanyahu into this process of being a war criminal. Well, they weren't very vociferous, although they issued an arrest warrant for Putin. We haven't heard an awful lot about a man who's created losses on a scale which are unimaginable and makes Stalingrad actually now look small. So I think there's some interesting biases where our global institutions have been infiltrated, like the UN too. They've all been taken to one side or the other by the autocracy. So we need to reshape our world and the way we think about it in the West, because the systems that we created in goodwill have been subverted.
Well, as we're talking about how, let's say lateral this thinking is, or the leadership of China is, we can think about this building up of resources on one hand, but this strategic or possibly strategic offensive that China has maybe launched in the US. Is it possible that the fentanyl epidemic in the US has been a deliberate and calculated part of China's plan to weaken part of the US?
It's been absolutely deliberate. I've written about it. And you've got to remember that foremost in the Chinese memory is the basis of the opium trade that Britain forced upon it, where essentially it needed another leg to the triangle with tea. And we created, millions and millions of Chinese addicts that undermined the cultural sustenance of a declining, decayed Chinese dynasty, and made it worse and created what they call the century of humiliation. So why wouldn't they turn around and think, well, we'll just feed fentanyl, and there's another drug that's even more addictive that's coming online? And how successful that process has been is using the same tools that the West used against China, and Britain did it back against America. So we should really consider this to be an attack, as there have been cyber attacks and everything else. And America needs to be far more alert to the hostile intent behind this process and bring its whole federal authority to bear to basically shut it down, which means all of the drugs or agencies which probably have connections in some way, and the others that don't. So I think we should view it as another form of subversive attack by the Chinese, without doubt.
We've also seen the US raise tariffs against China, especially targeting their electric vehicles and solar cells. How do you see these tariffs, netting out at the end of the day? Does that end up really being a negative for the country that's imposing them?
Well, no, I think the world is bifurcated now. Let's be realistic. There's an autocratic sphere of influence, even if you don't go to war in a Cold War model, that's right in front of our eyes. And the EU trying to shut down all the gas sanctions is finally because they don't literally need Russian gas to survive anymore. And strangely enough, this whole process where you are at war with Russia over Ukraine, and yet we are taking energy supplies from Russia, which then supports its war that we're now trying to fight against, seems a really bizarre paradigm. But in the First World War, I found a very similar circumstance, which surprised me. And that was that there were neutral countries in the First World War were Holland, and they were Denmark and Norway and Sweden. And they provided an enormous amount of resource to support essentially what was going on the front in the First World War. And America then supplied other resources into those neutral countries. But guess who provided all of those countries coal? Britain. So we were supplying neutral countries to these countries, which then sent their products to fight against us. So how does that happen? Well, it happens because the economic entwinement at the early stages of a conflict is such that if you collapse it totally, you endanger your ability to fight a war. So you have to wean yourself off gradually, which is what's happened with European gas. So in answer to your question, yes, the world's bifurcated. It isn't about whether the tariff punishes you or not. It's quite simply the separation of a global system into two systems. Those two systems are at war with each other, so you don't. But interesting enough, even in the early stages of these wars, there are still economic tentacles which reach out. And the ultimate end for Germany's economic, resource chain was when America joined the First World War, and finally the flow of resources stopped from America, and it also stopped at the same time because Britain did other measures of extreme blockade after winning Jutland, which stopped the other powers from doing it. And in no time at all, Germany started to starve. So in the case of Russia and China, their ever closer relationship is because they're aware of the fact they're already a separate system. And that also means de-dollarization for that system and a smaller dollar world, which means the dollar is going to fall out of bed. And and commodities at the same time are going to keep squeezing upwards, even in the pre-phases of conflict. But I think conflict is very, very close on a global scale because the hallmarks in terms of which commodities are moving. Gold and silver are a commodity and they're a safe haven. They have already broken out. Copper is doing exactly the same. Nickel is moving. Some of the wheat is moving in an interesting way. So that's another area. And you can argue it hasn't happened to oil. That's because Biden's been trying to suppress the price desperately for his election. But it will get above 92 and then it'll go above 130 and everyone will realize the whole thing really is about resources out of control, which brings us on to the issue of our central banks, who with their great vision believe they've got inflation under control again. And I always laugh because somehow their model doesn't seem to understand supply constriction in conflict. And that's what's going to overturn it again. So for those people hoping to get lower rates, low, cheaper bond prices, forget it. It's not going to happen. And in fact, the bond market is the greatest deathbed you could have for an investor because you've got increasing inflation. And as you go through this bifurcation and Cold War, even on the optimistic side, we're going to have to spend an awful lot more on weapons. I'm talking about 5 to 10% of our GDP on weapon systems to get back in the program. And of course, it comes by issuing bonds. So you do not want to be a bondholder right now. And I think that's one of the real danger areas. And that then increased yields, increased bond prices dropping is going to end what is a very narrow stock market rally. And things like the Russell 2000 are a far better indicator of where the US economy really is than the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ is really just a delusional sort of image. And if you look at the Magnificent Seven, most of them have turned around already. There's only one or two that look like they're at their peak. The others are already falling. So that story is very close to being ended, I think. But before that, you want to be in your safe havens. You want to be a big commodity investor. You want to be short the dollar. You want to be out of bonds. And there are some emerging markets which you want to be in, which are pro-Western, like Argentina. And there anything else that is in the other sphere of influence you want to be well away from.
Because of a seizure possibility?
Yeah, because think of the world at war. Mm-hmm. Do you want to be caught the other side? I mean, if you're an investor in China, you're not going to get your money out. Don't kid yourself.
Yeah.
Just like Russia's never going to get his money back. I mean, I don't understand. This is one thing I just don't get, is that there's some 300 billion of Russian funds in the West, in Europe and America, seized. Why don't, instead of giving the interest to Ukraine, which is negligible, just give them the principal amount and say this is in recompense for the enemy that we're having to change our whole system for. Use it now, not somewhere in the future. Make the bold decision. We know Russia's broken every rule of international law. It's not part of our system. So give that money to Ukraine. And the reason why not, I believe, is because Biden fundamentally is terrified of Ukraine winning. Because he's terrified and he's been brainwashed by this reflex strategy of Russia to say, if we're losing, we'll use nuclear weapons. So you've got an America that constantly puts the cap on success. And actually, it's done it so much so that whether it's the Magda Republicans or whether it's Biden, the Ukrainians are running out of people to fight with. And then we're going to have an issue of actually we're going to have to support the Ukrainians. Because as we realize, letting the Ukraine fall means it's going to be the border of NATO next. It's inevitable because Russia is on a wartime footing. Once you're in a wartime footing, it's like rolling downhill and running downhill. You can't stop. All you do is keep running faster. Mm-hmm. So we are in conflict. And the faster we wake up, the better chance we have of surviving the next phase, which is China on a scale that we really can't imagine. And I think the thing that, if you look at Chinese engineering, you look at Chinese feats and buildings and what they do and how they do it, it is a monster on a scale you can't equate to in the West. Just imagine that monster dedicated to war. It's terrifying. And it's only just warming up, even though, as you say, many things are hidden. So we need to be much more aware. We're seeing cyber attacks on a whole new level in America and Europe. I think the Baltimore Bridge impact is really interesting because I would ask myself, what is the chance that that ship lost its power and managed to hit one of the legs on a span of bridge that wide? And even if it didn't, let's just say it didn't intentionally manifest, it is a hallmark of what comes next. But that is that all of the technology that we use gets hijacked against us. EV cars are sensor systems on wheels with little bombs inside them. So if someone works out how to go and use them and target them and blow them up, who needs initial strikes with bombers? And the reason why that the Chinese are so into EV cars, and this is really, it's not just because they're green people and follow this lovely idea of keeping the planet the same. It's really simple. They know they won't have enough oil in the early stages of a conflict, but that's why they build coal-fired stations, because coal is available to them. So they can power their EV cars with their coal stations, and they can carry in a wartime environment.
As most EVs are powered.
Yeah. So this is the ironic thing about it, is that basically this technology that we're looking at is actually about how to sustain China in a conflict with a different energy profile that can't import oil. And so the dynamic, so lithium, for example, is going up because lithium in the Chinese sphere of influence won't be available to the West and vice versa. So it's a question, if you are an investor, to make sure where you are physically invested in as a company sits in the right sphere of trading influence post a conflict. Can that material be taken back to the place where it can be used?
David, how do you tie your model of thinking into understanding how the markets behave? Can you walk us through what some of the tools are that you use to understand where the markets are headed as you tie them to these global conflicts?
So the biggest issue is the empire cycle, which, and the point at which one system is declining sufficiently for another challenge to be made. The scale of the challenge we're living through is a 500-year cycle. So that's one thing. I would say cycles like Germany, Britain, Britain, France, and France, Spain were actually smaller cycles. This is a massive cycle. It's not just about countries, it's about whole super systems. So that's the first thing. The timing of that process can be monitored with a Kondratiev wave, which is this 56-year cycle. It shows itself very clearly in price patterns in all commodities, but you can see it clearly in oil. So there's the first place, the biggest degree price pattern. And within that cycle, we're in the C wave, which is started in 2020 into 2030. It's the third most powerful surge in commodities of the up cycle in the K wave cycle. And then I use an awful lot of price-based systems, which I use on different fractals of long-term and short-term, covering 80 different markets and all the sectors. And I integrate them together. It gives me a marvelous sense of timing of what really is happening, not what people tell you has happened, which is one of the reasons why we've been huge advocates of gold and silver and Bitcoin as safe havens. And we've had incredible trades long since about 1800 with a $20 stop. And similar for silver, we're just on the ride here. We monitor it as it goes up. We monitor corrections, but at the moment, the surge continues.
How have the bond markets responded to these higher interest rates and stimulus around the world? And how do you see this current bond situation, David?
Well, I just had to laugh as everyone came in the year super bullish of bonds. And, everyone was bullish, but that's the highest stood ever since. So we're bumping and scraping our way down back to the lows of 23, where I think we will penetrate it. And, I think that people will be quite slow to see the gold and silver as something that should be threatening bonds. They'll be a little slow to see copper as threatening bonds, but the moment that nat gas keeps moving up and then oil soon moving up, the reality of when I started trading in the 80s, bonds were linked to commodities. So bonds and commodities are inverse relationship when these things start to move. So we're going to see, we've got 20 years of bond traders who don't even understand that correlation, and they're about to find out just how strong it can be.
So, as you're mentioning gold and silver there, David, what is your cycle timing for gold telling you about its trajectory for its behavior for the rest of this decade?
Well, just think of the most likely peak is into 2030. So we're still 6 years away from that peak. And the same for silver. And we've just broken out of the previous highs. I mean, gold is actually on an inflation-based basis higher than it's ever been before in history. And it's got a long way to go, and need to think about it in a simple term. Think about all that printed money trying to get itself all into to be reinforced by gold. It's just not enough to go around. Mm-hmm. So what happens? The price of gold goes up to try and match the fiat money available. I think ultimately in 2030 we might see 10,000, and that's because we will see excess towards and into the peak. And same with silver, could be to 100. But again, it's a ride you sit on. It's obviously going to be increasingly volatile in nominal terms, and percentage terms less so. But mining companies have been a really favorite. They're hugely leveraged. Silver miners got massive leverage right now. So the whole sector looks really good. But remember, I've been long of it really since some fantastic lows at the end of the correction. So, just because you pile in, because you listen to me, that's your where you enter and how you control your risk. That's your problem, not mine if you're a late entry.
Yeah. Does the demand for gold by the Eastern central banks fit into your analysis of the metal, or do you analyze these markets without news events just to rely on the human behavior models instead?
Everything is based on what I see. It's not about what people say or the rumors or the other stories, although they are coincident. Central banks will naturally want to have more gold as they realize it actually has value. And the best way people realize something has value is watching it go up. They never have enough vision to buy it before it goes up. So that's part of a coincident behavior that I'm not surprised at. Mm-hmm. And I'm certainly not surprised that the Chinese are hoarding it. Absolutely not, because that's what you do for conflict.
Right. David, you mentioned a little bit ago that there's, all of these dollars and all of this fiat money that has been printed over the last 4 years that is now trying to find a space in gold. Do you see the commodities complex in general as responding to this inflationary impulse that was kicked off? And what is that timeline for this commodity cycle peak?
Look, I think the initially we're at the stage of the real demand phase, because most of the not so smart investors won't even see this as an opportunity. You need to get to the midpoint before I want some comes in scale. Mm-hmm. So we're a long way from that, actually. I mean, gold and silver, as they move up, are moving towards a point like that, but they're still before the point. And so this is more about real demand and real things versus a fiat world of imaginary wealth. And that's and a wartime paradigm of security and safe havenship. So those are the key drivers I would look at this stage of the phase.
So, David, can I ask you that question in a different way? Is this something like a commodity super cycle that ends up affecting the entire commodities complex as a whole?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, every single physical resource is going to go through the roof.
Is war hugely inflationary for all of these materials as well?
So if you look at the First World War, which was very much a Kondratiev cycle, as in similar to where we are right now, essentially commodities and resources went up into the conflict. Mm-hmm. And they didn't peak until 2020 in some cases, after the war. But if you look at the Second World War, it's slightly different, because the Second World War was really just part two that started in part one with a pause. And it wasn't so much triggered by where the Kondratiev cycle was. It was just when Germany was ready to do it again. And for a period of time, commodities behaved quite differently. And there's a whole detailed analysis, which for my investor base, that basically I did on the two wars that explains that. It's a bit more complicated than it sounds. And only if you break it open using these cycles can you really get to the bottom of it.
Mm-hmm. So, David, with all of these conflicts that we're kind of keeping an eye on here, as well as the November election that is, very likely going to be very hotly contested, what are you keeping an eye on for the rest of this year, or what developments do you think are important to be aware of?
I think the way the war in Ukraine is changing Europe's perception that it is at war, and the fact that Putin has put his economy on a war economy integrated with Russia's, mm-hmm. and it's a very real threat. So whereas America might be ambivalent, Europe is slowly waking up from a deep slumber. but it's just not dynamic enough as it wakes up. So I would say that it was in denial that a war could ever be so, even a first year into Ukraine. Now it's gone, oh my goodness, that could be a real war. But as often happens in denial, the response is too slow. And what you should do is slam it into fifth gear rather than trudge along in first gear. So we've got that process taking place. In America, I think there's a sense of displacement from everything that's happened in Europe, as happened in 1914 and 1939. But it's about to get really woken up when it gets clubbed by China, which is no different from what happened in Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. So there's a wake up. And I hear people like Ray Dalio talking about the chance of civil war and, seeding more undermining constructs for America. And I would just say quite simply, you'll be at war with China long before America fights each half. And that's because China will see the elements of civil war as a weakness, of political divisiveness, as we're seeing in this election year, and it'll be part of its decision to move forward and strike America. So you never get to that stage when you have a hegemon in the state of China looking to challenge.
Well, some dark and, consequential things to keep in mind there, David. As we wrap up today, is there anything that you'd like to leave our listeners to think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Western world's moved from a phase of denial mm-hmm. to an increasing realization that war is already upon us. And the natural phase with that is to say, well, it's coming. It will be here. It's now a possibility. But in fact, if you were in a phase of denial initially, I guarantee you that mindset will never move quickly enough to adapt to the threat. So our challenge in the West is to leap from first gear to fifth gear yesterday mm-hmm. and mobilize ourselves. And only today did I see the UK government launch a resilience campaign in terms of emergency resilience. Now, that's really interesting because it talks about floods being the biggest threat. And the last one is nuclear war. And the one before that is war. And I had to laugh because the bottom line, they're not starting it from floods. They're starting because even they're realizing there's major danger ahead. So we need to really just wake up collectively to push the danger button. Now, in America, where these elections are taking place that govern who leads us, there is a terrible choice afoot. There's a man who is going through a series of court cases, and we're seeing the public who didn't realize who he was should really see who he was in that process. But they should also remember that he left the US Navy in disarray. Having said he would make America great, the weakness in the American Navy, which is getting weaker, not stronger, is all laid down by his failed policies. So he is not the man to actually protect the West, whatever his foibles. And on the same side, nor is Biden, because he makes Biden's Chamberlain's appeasement look weak, and his ability to conduct conflict is proven to be a disaster. So between the two of them, we're looking at two disastrous options. And I think that's what's really scary. And what must be emboldening our enemies right now is, we are not led by the strong or the visionary or the strategically capable. And there's no one in the wings at the moment that can fill that gap, which makes me think there is a risk of some kind of military process that overturns the process of democracy in the desperation of survival. And it will get an awful lot worse before that conversation takes place. But the political system of the free world is broken. Mm-hmm. And so in emergency, and we're talking about after America's been kicked out of the Asian basin, or somewhere that really feels like Norway on steroids for Britain, as it did when Chamberlain fell and Churchill came in, will be some momentous occasion like that. So I think we're in for some, if we're going to survive, we need to think about adaptation. And somehow or another, we need to realize that our leadership is not up to it on either side of the aisle, and stop fighting about which side of the aisle we choose, and actually turn around and demand more from both sides, one way or the other, to find great leadership within either party and bring it to the fore.
Yeah, as I'm listening to your explanation on a lot of these things, it makes me really think that it is almost impossible to catch up once you have, or to try to catch up once you have neglected a lot of these systems, a lot of these weapons, a lot of this strategic preparation in a lot of ways.
There's a really good example, which I just find fascinating, and that is right now the US Navy is in danger of saturation attacks from the Chinese, and it needs missile silos and missiles. Its problem is the production rate for things like SM-6s and Patriots is in the like 650 a year numbers, teeny. But even so, you still need cells on warships to launch them from. And you have 20 Ticonderoga-class cruisers who are old, they cost money to maintain, but basically they're being taken out of service and they have 128 Mark 41 launchers, which is more than an Aegis-class destroyer with 96, and they're being taken out of line at a time when they're needed. Surely someone should be saying, I know they're old and decrepit, but spend whatever it takes to keep them online because we need their extra 20 times 128 cells. And it's decisions like that that I just find, and the Chinese must laugh at because it's exactly falling into their hands and strategy. So we need to really have, what we need is the return of strategic thinking to the West. And there's an article which I wrote about. It's really interesting, and I'm going to leave it with you. Is that we all remember Britain was saved by the Battle of Britain, and it was a momentous, struggle. But we forget. I think there are three people, individuals, who allowed Britain to survive and win the Battle of Britain. First of all, there was a wife of a very rich man who died, who supported Supermarine in terms of their development of a float plane, which was in the Snyder Trophy and won. It was the origins of the Spitfire. And her funding did that when otherwise they would collapse, which provided the basis to create the Spitfire. And the Spitfire was essential because it took on the Messerschmitt 109s and let the Hurricanes deal with the bombers. So without the Spitfire, it would have been very different. But next came another man called Hugh Dowding, who was head of research at the RAF in 1936, very innovative lateral man, and he understood the power of radar and the idea of like integrated air defense. And then he went on, when public demand asked the Air Ministry to create Fighter Command, to basically build Fighter Command, integrated Hurricane, Spitfires, radar systems, observers, in a way that no one ever imagined integrated air defense could be. And the other man was Beaverbrook, who he was a newspaper magnate, and he revolutionized aircraft production such that when the battle came, we weren't short of aeroplanes, we became short of pilots. He repaired planes that were damaged, made new ones on a scale that Britain could never imagine. And the net result, on top of the bravery of the pilots and all of the other RAF members that were involved with it, we repelled Germany. That wasn't because the government did it. It was because three lateral individuals had vision and created the framework for resistance. So I think we should stop looking to our government to solutions and start seeing lateral thinking individuals rise to the fore, working together to start putting in place the vision that the government doesn't have in the way that new weapon systems and evolutions of war take place.
Well put, David. For anybody that wants more of David's work, it's all available at David Murin, MURRIN.co.uk. And you put a lot of links on Twitter as well, at Global Forecaster, FORCASTR. David, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate you explaining.
It's always a pleasure, Tom. Sorry, it's a dark subject.
Well, I'd much rather an accurate analysis of where we are rather than burying our heads in the sand, right? And maybe it makes some of our listeners think about what is ahead of us rather than, be distracted by the next shiny news piece.
Or indeed fighting amongst ourselves. Because whatever our bipartisan differences are, they're small compared to the differences of democracy versus autocracy.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent, David. Thanks again for your time.
Thanks, Tom.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.